She's just a hysterical woman who doesn't understand construction. What Rod didn't know was who signs his license, and within the week, he had none. The inspector's clipboard clicked twice against the doorframe, and Rod laughed, that easy, wet laugh he used on men in parking lots, and said, "Don't mind her. She's just a hysterical woman who doesn't understand construction." The trailer smelled of sawdust and the fake lemon spray they used to cover mildew, and behind him, my kitchen sat gutted to the studs, 16 weeks past the promised finish date, the subfloor spongy under a sheet of Tyvek nobody had bothered to tape. I had a folder in my hands with 41 photographs in it. I had a moisture reading of 24% on a joist that should have been under 15. I had a $120,000 wire receipt with Rod's LLC on the memo line. And the inspector, a soft, tired man named Dwayne, just nodded at Rod like they'd shared a beer once and wrote something small and didn't look at me at all. My father's chalk line reel was in my coat pocket, the blue chalk cool through the canvas, and I held it the way other people hold a rosary. Rod thought he was talking to a homeowner who'd gotten in over her head. He had no idea he was talking to the one person in the state of Ohio whose signature sat at the bottom of the document that let him call himself a contractor at all. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning is the only part he'd remember fondly. I grew up in Lorain, Ohio, in a 2-bedroom on Reed Avenue, where my father, Emil Sorensen, ran a one-man Finnish carpentry outfit out of a rusted-out 1986 Ford E150. He hung crown molding for people who owned the kind of houses we cleaned on weekends. He was precise the way religious people are precise. He owned exactly the tools he needed, and not one more, and the one he loved best was a Stanley chalk line reel, cast aluminum, worn to a shine at the crank, filled with a powder blue chalk that got into the creases of his hands and never fully came out. He'd snap a line across a subfloor, and it would land dead true, a horizon somebody could build a whole room against, and he'd say, "Blythe, a straight line is just the truth laid down where everybody can see it." He died when I was 26. The reel is the only thing of his I kept. I put myself through the University of Toledo on Pell Grants and a job at a lumber yard, where I learned to read a load ticket and spot green wood and tell a man twice my age that his order was wrong without flinching. I got a civil engineering degree in 2003 and a PE license in 2007. I did 7 years in a structural firm in Cleveland, then took a pay cut to work for the state, because the state is where the rules actually get written, and I had grown up watching good tradesmen get eaten alive by men who didn't follow them. By 2019, I was the deputy administrator of the Ohio Board of Building Standards. By 2022, I was the state building commissioner. That's the title I don't lead with at parties. It means, in plain terms, that I sit at the top of the system that licenses commercial builders, adopts the residential code, and, through my seat on and authority over the enforcement side, decides who gets to hold a contractor's registration and a surety bond in this state, and who gets those things taken away. I am, quite literally, the woman who does not understand construction. I bought the house in Clintonville, a leafy pocket of North Columbus, in the spring of 2023. A 1926 four-square, 2,400 square feet, brick, with a sleeping porch and good bones, and one catastrophically bad 1978 kitchen addition. I paid $410,000 for it. It was the first house I ever owned alone, and I wanted to do right by it. Restore the plaster, open the back of the first floor, put in a real kitchen where my father's ghost could have made himself a sandwich. I didn't want to pull rank. I wanted to be an ordinary homeowner and hire an ordinary contractor and have it go the way it's supposed to go for the people who don't have my phone numbers. That was my mistake, and I own it. I met Rod Bellamy at a Parade of Homes event in Dublin in June 2023. Bellamy Custom Builders had a slick booth and a laminated portfolio and a truck with gold lettering. Rod was 51, big through the shoulders, with a handshake he'd clearly practiced, and a habit of calling women sweetheart and hun in a way that landed just short of something you could name. His reviews online were a wall of 5 stars. He talked about craftsmanship. He said, "I treat every house like it's my own mother's." And I, who should have known better, liked the sound of it. I checked his registration myself, Habit, and it was clean, active, a $25,000 surety bond on file, no open complaints. He looked, on paper, like exactly the kind of contractor the system is supposed to produce. We signed in August 2023. The contract was $215,000 for a full kitchen renovation, structural opening between the kitchen and dining room, new footing for a beam, and restoration of the sleeping porch. I paid $120,000 up front, a deposit larger than I'd have advised anyone else to pay, but he had a story about lumber prices and a subcontractor who needed committing, and I wanted the good subs, so I wired it on September 8th. I have the confirmation. I keep everything. My father taught me that a receipt is just the truth laid down where everybody can see it, though he never used those words. The good weeks lasted about a month. The first wrong note was small, the way they always are. Rod's crew was supposed to start at 8. By late September, they were rolling in at 10, sometimes noon, sometimes not at all. When I mentioned it, Rod put a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder and said, "Hun, you can't rush a house. You want it done fast or done right." As if those were the only 2 options, as if I hadn't spent 20 years around men who did both. The second note, the beam, the structural opening between the kitchen and dining room, required an engineered LVL beam, sized to carry the second floor, and it required a proper footing under the new post. That's not aesthetics. That's the difference between a house that stands and a house that sags into its own middle over 10 years. The permit set called for a specific beam and a poured footing. In October, I came home early from a code hearing in Columbus and found Rod's laborer setting the post directly on the existing slab. No footing, no pour. The old LVL sticker still on a beam that was 1 size under spec. I asked about the footing. Rod told me his engineer had signed off. I asked for the engineer's name. He changed the subject to tile. I didn't argue in the hallway. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the tub, and took my father's chalkline reel out of my bag and turned the crank slowly, feeling the string wind in, the blue chalk sifting a little onto my fingers. I thought about the word engineer coming out of Rod's mouth like a card he was sure I couldn't call, and I started, that night, doing the thing I do best. I started keeping a file. The third note was the drywall over the plumbing. In November, his crew closed up the wall behind the new sink before the rough plumbing was inspected. That's backward. You inspect the guts before you bury them. That's the whole point of an inspection. When I pointed out that we'd skipped the plumbing rough-in sign-off, Rod said the inspector was a buddy and had eyeballed it. I asked to see the inspection record in the county portal. There wasn't one. There was a note that said verbal, okay per Rod. I photographed my own screen. By December, the finish date had slipped from Thanksgiving to after the holidays. My kitchen was a cave of plastic sheeting and a single work light on a yellow cord. I was washing dishes in the basement laundry sink and eating off a card table. The back door didn't latch right and swung open in the wind, and I'd wake at 3 a.m. to it banging against the jamb and lie there doing math. I'd paid $120,000 and gotten, by my own conservative estimate, maybe $38,000 of actual work, half of it wrong. Here is the thing people never believe about me. I stayed calm. Not because I'm a saint. Because I've watched 100 homeowners lose in front of the board. Good, furious, weeping people, and they always lost for the same reason. They led with their feelings and let the contractor lead with paper. The one who keeps the cleaner file wins. So I kept my voice level and my folder growing. 41 photographs by January, Every text, every change date, the moisture readings I took myself with a Klein meter I bought for $54 because the subfloor near the porch had started to smell like a pond. In January, I did something I should have done sooner. I called Marcus. Marcus Okafor and I went back to the Cleveland firm. He was the best structural engineer I'd ever worked with, the kind who'll drive 2 hours to look at a cracked footing on a Saturday because it bothers him not to know. I asked him to come look at my house, not as my friend, but as a hired PE at his rate, $185 an hour, a real invoice, because I wanted his report to be unimpeachable if it ever had to stand alone. He came on a Sunday in a Carhartt jacket with a flashlight and a level, and that quiet frown he gets. He was under my house for 40 minutes. When he came up, he had cobwebs in his gray hair and dirt on his knees, and he didn't make a speech. He set his level on my card table and said, "Blythe, the post under the new beam is bearing on 4-inch slab with no footing. The beam is one size under what the stamped set calls for, and there's active moisture at the porch band joist because somebody flashed it backwards. The water's running into the house instead of off it. If this stays like this, in 8-10 years, you've got structural sag and rot in the porch framing. Somebody built you a problem and hid it behind drywall on purpose." "On purpose," I said. "You don't close a wall before rough inspection by accident," Marcus said. "You do it so nobody sees what's behind it." He wrote it up. 11 pages, stamped, dated February 3rd, 2024. Photographs, calculations, the whole spine of it. He charged me for 6 hours, and I made him take it because his integrity was the entire value of the document. I had the report, I had the file, and I had, quietly, one more thing. I knew exactly which levers moved in the machine that governed Rod Bellamy's right to work because I was the person who oversaw that machine. But knowing where the levers are is not the same as being allowed to yank them because a man was rude to you in your own kitchen. That distinction mattered to me more than my anger did. If I was going to use what I was going to use it clean, through the process, on the evidence, in a way that would survive an appeal, a lawsuit, and a mirror. So before I touched any of it, I called Ingrid. Ingrid Vance was a construction litigation attorney in Columbus, 63 years old, silver bob, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a voice like a dry martini. I'd known her professionally for a decade and trusted her precisely because she'd told me no twice when I was right, but couldn't prove it. I laid the whole thing out on her conference table, the wire, the contract, Marcus's report, the 41 photographs, the county portal with its verbal "okay per rod," and I said the sentence that had been forming in me for 2 months. "Ingrid, I want to do this by the book so hard that the book itself would blush. I don't want a favor, I want a record." She looked at me over the beaded chain. "You understand that most people in your chair scream at me and want it done Tuesday. I know exactly how long it takes done right," I said, "and I know what it costs to do it wrong. I've watched from the bench." She almost smiled. "Then here's the sequence," and she laid it out, and it was the coldest, most beautiful thing. Not revenge, procedure, which in the right hands is the same thing wearing a suit. First, a demand. Certified letter to Bellamy Custom Builders, February 12th, itemizing the deficient work, attaching Marcus's stamped report, demanding either a cure to code within 30 days at Rod's cost or return of the unearned portion of the deposit, $82,000 by our accounting. Documented, reasonable. A record of a chance given. Rod's response came March 1st on his LLC letterhead, and I have it framed in my memory. He wrote that the work was completed to industry standard, that Marcus was a friend of the owner and biased, and, this is the line, that the homeowner has become emotional and difficult and does not understand the construction process. He copied his own bonding agent and, incredibly, the county building department, as though papering my file for me. He thought he was building a defense. He was signing a confession. Second, the complaint. Not a lawsuit first, a formal complaint to the Enforcement Division that handles contractor registration and bond claims, the process any homeowner can use, the one most of them don't know exists or can't navigate. Ingrid filed it March 6th on my behalf. I want to be exact about what I did and did not do here because it's the whole point. I did not call anyone at the board and ask them to skin Rod for me. I did not use my office to jump the line. I recused myself in writing from any adjudicative role in the matter on March 6th, the same day a signed memo to the board's chief legal counsel so that no one could ever say the commissioner leaned on the process. I filed as Blythe Sorensen, homeowner, 4100 block of Clintonville, one more complainant in the stack. I just happened to be a complainant who knew that a stack existed and how it was read and what made a file impossible to dismiss. And I knew something else. When Ingrid pulled Rod's registration history for the complaint, she found what I'd suspected since the day he told me an inspector was a buddy. My complaint was not the first. There were 4 others in 18 months. A couple in Westerville out $60,000. A widow in Gahanna out $44,000. A young pair in Hilliard whose garage foundation was cracking. Every one of them talked out of the process or worn down until they walked away, because Rod's whole method was choosing homeowners he could make feel small. The system had a hole in it, exactly the shape of a man like Rod. He counted on victims who didn't understand construction. He'd finally billed that trick to the one who wrote the code. Third, the bond. This is the part homeowners never reach. Every registered contractor in the state carries a surety bond. Rod's was $25,000 with Keystone Surety out of Cincinnati, and that bond exists precisely to make defrauded owners whole. Filing a valid claim against it does 2 things. It moves money, and it puts the surety on notice that their principal is a liability, which is the beginning of a contractor becoming uninsurable, which is the beginning of a contractor becoming an ex-contractor. Ingrid filed the bond claim March 8th with Marcus's report attached. Clean, documented, impossible to wave away as hysteria. Then we waited, and I let Rod keep doing the thing that would finish him, talking. I need to tell you about the inspector, because he's where the system first sided with Rod, and where it started to turn. Dwayne Pruitt had been a residential inspector for the county for 19 years, 11 months from a pension. He was not corrupt in the movie sense. He was tired and conflict-averse, and Rod bought his lunch sometimes, and it was easier to write verbal okay than to fail a wall and start a fight. When Rod said, "She's just a hysterical woman who doesn't understand construction," in my trailer that day in early April, Dwayne nodded, because nodding was the path of least resistance, and he left without pulling the drywall. But Dwayne, it turned out, had a conscience with a 19-year build on it. 2 days later, he called me, not Rod, me, from his personal cell, and his voice was rough. He said, "Ms. Sorensen, I looked up your complaint in the system after I left." A pause. It listed your employer. Another pause, longer. "I didn't know who you were. I want that on the record. And I want on the record that I should have pulled that wall the first time, bond claim or no bond claim, and I didn't, and that's on me." He offered to give a statement, a true one, about the verbal okay per Rod entries, about the closed walls, about the culture of it. I told him to call Ingrid, not me, and to tell her the same thing he'd tell God. He did. His statement, signed April 9th, was the thing that turned my private homeowner complaint into a documented pattern of an inspector being maneuvered by a contractor who did this routinely. Dwayne retired 11 months early rather than sit on it. I have never respected a tired man more. The reckoning had a date on it before Rod ever knew there was going to be one. Every year, the Columbus chapter of a housing nonprofit, Homefront Columbus, which rehabs houses for families aging out of foster care, runs a spring home tour charity showcase, a weekend where builders and remodelers open finished projects to the public, sell tickets, and raise money. It's a big deal in the local trades. Bellamy Custom Builders had a booth every year. Rod loved it, loved the plaque, loved being photographed with a hard hat he never wore on an actual site. The 2024 showcase fell on the third weekend of April at a restored Foursquare in German Village, and the State Contractors Board, the enforcement side, the people who process exactly the kind of complaint I'd filed, always sent representatives, because it's where the whole industry stands in one room. Ingrid and I did not choose the showcase for theater. We chose it because the Enforcement Division had, entirely on its own timeline and its own evidence, scheduled the disposition of Rod's accumulated complaints for that week, and because the surety had, on its own, moved to deny Rod's renewal after the bond claim. It all simply came due within the week of that Saturday. I could have let it happen by mail. I chose to be in the room because I had watched 5 families lose to this man in silence, and I wanted the silence to end where he could see it. I wore a plain navy dress. I brought my father's chalk line reel in my bag because I bring it to things that matter, and because I wanted something of Emil Sorensen in the room when the truth got laid down where everybody could see it. Rod saw me by the refreshment table around 2 o'clock and did his big, warm laugh, the one for parking lots, and said, loud enough for the men around him, "There's my difficult homeowner. Couldn't stay away from a real construction event, huh, sweetheart?" A few of them chuckled. He was still, at that exact moment, absolutely certain of what I was. I said, "Hello, Rod," nothing else. I have learned that cold composure costs a man more than any speech. He starts filling the silence himself, and he never fills it well. At 2:15, the chapter director of Homefront called the room to a loose quiet to thank the sponsors, and near the front stood a woman I knew, Priya Desai, Chief Enforcement Counsel for the State Contractors Board, whom I had not called, had not lobbied, had scrupulously not spoken to about my case since the day I recused myself. She was there in her official capacity because the board is a showcase sponsor, and beside her stood a man from Keystone Surety with a folder. Rod worked the room toward the front because Rod always moved toward the cameras. And Priya, seeing him, did the ordinary, devastating thing that the system does when the file is finally clean enough. She did her job. She stepped to him, quietly, professionally, and I was close enough to hear it because I had positioned myself to hear it. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, "I'm Priya Desai, Chief Enforcement Counsel for the State Contractors Board. You've been served notice at your business address, but I'll advise you here as a courtesy. Effective this week, based on 5 substantiated complaints and a finding of a pattern of concealment and fraud, the board has suspended your contractor registration, pending revocation, and Keystone has denied your bond renewal and paid a claim against your existing bond. You are, as of the order dated this Tuesday, not licensed or bonded to contract for residential construction in the state of Ohio." I watched the blood leave Rod's face in real time. It's a strange thing to see on a big man. The color going out of the skin from the top down, the mouth working before sound comes. He said, "This is a mistake. Whose complaint? On whose say-so?" He was still looking for the man he could handle. And here is the only moment I allowed myself. I stepped forward, into his eye line, and I said it plainly, because the prompt of my whole life had been building to a single legible sentence. "On mine, Rod, Blythe Sorensen. I'm the State Building Commissioner. I've held the office since 2022. I'm the reason your registration existed, and I'm one of 5 reasons it doesn't anymore." I let that sit for 1 full second in the quiet room. I filed as a homeowner. I recused myself the same day, in writing, so that not one comma of this could be undone on appeal. I didn't have to bend a single rule. You built me a problem and hid it behind drywall. And it turns out I'm the one person in Ohio who reads what's behind the wall for a living. The refreshment table had gone silent. Somewhere, a caterer set down a tray too hard and it rang. Rod's mouth moved. You never said. You set me up. I hired a contractor and paid him $120,000 and asked him to do it right, I said. You did the rest to yourself. Every date you moved, every wall you closed, every time you called me hysterical in front of an inspector, you were building the file. I just kept it. I looked at Priya and at the man from Keystone, and back at Rod, whose hands had started to shake. The board sided with the evidence, Rod. It always would have. You just never met a homeowner who knew that. He begged. That's the part I'll spare him and not spare, because it's true and it's the whole shape of him. This big man who called me sweetheart put his hand out toward my arm and said, Blythe, Ms. Sorensen, we can fix it. I'll fix everything myself this weekend. No charge, please. This is my whole... And I stepped back so his hand closed on air, and I said, You're not licensed to touch my house or anyone's. That's the point of a license. Priya said his name once, quietly, the way you'd steer a man toward the door, and two people from the board walked him out past the plaque he loved, and the gold-lettered truck in the lot that he'd have to re-letter now, because Bellamy Custom Builders was, as of that Tuesday, a phrase that meant nothing legal at all. I did not feel triumphant, exactly, standing there. I felt the way you feel when a chalk line finally snaps true, a small, clean rightness, a horizon somebody could build against. The numbers came out over the following weeks the way clean things do. The bond paid $25,000 toward my losses. The civil case Ingrid filed for the unearned deposit, Marcus's costs, and the corrective construction settled in mediation on July 30th, 2024 for $146,000 when Rod's own insurer looked at Marcus's stamped report and the enforcement order and the inspector's signed statement and told him he had no case that survived a courtroom. Between the bond and the settlement, I was made whole and then some, $171,000 recovered against a $120,000 deposit and roughly $60,000 in corrective work. The Westerville couple and the widow in Dehanna and the young pair in Hilliard, whose complaints my file had reawakened, filed their own bond and civil claims on the pattern our record had established. The last I heard, 3 of the 4 had recovered real money. That's the part I'm proudest of. I didn't just get mine back. I turned a hole in the system into 5 families getting made whole, because I refused to lose quietly the way I was supposed to. Rod's registration was formally revoked in September 2024, a 5-year bar before he can even reapply, and no surety in the state will write him a bond, which is the same as forever. He sells cars now, I'm told, at a lot off Route 23. I hope he's honest about the mileage. I truly don't think about him much. Marcus and Ingrid and Dwayne came to the house for dinner on a Saturday in late October after the kitchen was finally, actually finished, done right by a small crew a friend vouched for, footing poured, beam sized correctly, porch band joist flashed so the water runs off the house the way water is supposed to. My kitchen has quarter-sawn oak counters and a farmhouse sink and a window over it that catches the 4 o'clock light. Marcus brought a bottle of Rioja and stood in the middle of the room turning in a slow circle, checking my lines out of pure habit, and when he couldn't find anything wrong, he grinned like a kid. Ingrid, who never softens, softened 1 degree and said, "You did it clean, Blythe, cleaner than clean." I've practiced 40 years, and I've never seen a file that good. Dwayne came in a sport coat, awkward and decent, and I poured him the first glass and told the table what he'd done, that he'd retired 11 months early rather than sit on the truth, and made him take the toast, even though he turned red and looked at his shoes. I gave Dwayne that night a good miter box and a set of my father's chisels, the ones Emil never let anyone else touch. Because a man who chooses the truth over an easy pension has earned a carpenter's tools, and because keeping them in a drawer felt like keeping a straight line hidden. They left near midnight. The back door latches now. It closed with a soft, solid sound, the sound of a thing built right. I stayed up alone in the finished kitchen with the new subfloor bare in the pantry alcove, the one square I'd saved to do myself. I took my father's chalk line reel out of the drawer, the cast aluminum warm from the day, the crank worn shiny, the powder blue chalk fine as pond silt on my fingers. I hooked the line at one wall, walked it to the other, pulled it taut, lifted it a few inches, and let it go. It snapped down clean and true, a blue horizon across the floor of the house that was, at last and entirely, mine. No lien, no claim, no man's name on it but my own. And Emil Sorensen's daughter, who understands construction just fine, knelt down and began, straight along the truth she'd laid where everybody could see it, to build.